first thing we have to do is be willing to acknowledge that families matter, that what's happened to families in the US has not been good for kids. There's a lot of resistance to just acknowledging that. Fundamentally, how kids do in this world is going to come down a lot to parents. If you just look at the federal budget, there is pitifully little dedicated to programs that are aimed at strengthening and supporting stable and healthy families. We haven't made strengthening families a priority.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Lila Rose podcast. Today, we're going to be talking with Melissa Kearney, who is a professor of economics at the University of Maryland and the author of The Two-Parent Privilege. Now, we have a very interesting conversation because Melissa lays out her research about why, yes, surprise, surprise, it is best for children to be raised by married parents in a two-parent household. We talk about the challenges for single parents and some of the things that we need to do to support single parents. We talk about the best public policy and the kind of cultural a view that we should have of a society. Towards the end of the conversation, we get into a little bit of maybe a disagreement, which is interesting, where we talk about if there are differences between mothers raising children versus fathers, and Melissa's research or opinion on that. So you're going to hear that towards the end. As always, I hope that you enjoy this episode. I hope it gives you some food for thought and also some interesting research that you can use in your own conversations and your own work. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lila Rose podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, and also subscribe on YouTube and ring that notification bell so you never miss another episode. Melissa Kearney, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me here.
So your book, Two-Parent Privilege, has sparked a fair amount of controversy. You'd think that that wouldn't be a controversial thing to stand by, that children are best off with having two parents and an intact family, but there's a lot to get into here. So first of all, why did you write Two-Parent Privilege?
I wrote the book because I've been studying child well-being from an economics perspective and income inequality and poverty in the U.S. for over 2 decades. And it's just abundantly clear from all of the data and all of the evidence and all of the studies that family structure is really important to how kids do in this country and to overall trends in inequality and child well-being. And so I felt like it was long past time that our economic and policy conversation around those topics dealt head on with the issue of family structure. So that was really what I was hoping to accomplish with this book, is putting forward an economic case for two-parent families and for paying attention to what's happened and to try and get strengthening families on the policy agenda.
Now, you're a professor of economics at the University of Maryland, so this is your wheelhouse. What was it, though, specifically? I mean, there's all kinds of things you can study in the field of economics. Why was it family structures that personally you came to care about personally and obviously focus so much of your research on?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I'm trying to think about what brought me to the topic. I didn't necessarily set out to study families per se, but early on in my career, actually as an undergraduate, I spent a summer working at a welfare to work center. I was summer before my senior year in college. So what was I, like 21 years old? And I was working at a welfare to work center in Bridgeport, Connecticut with a bunch of women about my age or younger who were moms. And I was studying economics and sociology and policy in college. And it really just got me wondering, what is it about the economic environment and our opportunities that lead people to make such different, to land in such different places in life? So actually the first paper I wrote as an undergraduate was the economic determinants of when a woman initiates childbearing. And so I really came to it really with an interest in women more than family structure per se, and what made women more, gave us more economic opportunities, et cetera. So I think that's initially how I came to the topic of studying what's called the economics of fertility or the economics of families. And then it was almost like a parallel research agenda that I was pursuing on causes and consequences of income inequality. And as it so happens, the two very much intersect in ways that I think is underappreciated. So that's sort of how I came to it.
Did you know that most of the meat in your grocery store and the chicken, you have no idea where it comes from? It might say product of the USA, but it actually is not from the USA. That's a label that's stuck on it once it's imported in from another country. The reality is you should know where your food comes from, especially your meat, and we should be supporting local ranchers. And that's why I love GoodRanchers.com. GoodRanchers.com supports American meat delivered. So you can get best-in-class beef, poultry, pork, fish from American ranchers. If you go to GoodRanchers.com today, you can get a subscription box, get these great cuts of meat and chicken. Trust me, this chicken and this beef is better than what you'll find in the grocery store. That's why my family and I love it so much. If you go to GoodRanchers.com today and get a subscription, you can actually qualify for a full year of free chicken. Their chicken's amazing, by the way. They say come for the beef at Good Ranchers and stay for the chicken. You can get a whole year of free chicken using the code Lila at checkout. So go to GoodRanchers.com, support your local ranchers, get some amazing beef and poultry, and get 1 year of free chicken using the code Lila at checkout at GoodRanchers.com. All right, so there's a lot to unpack here. And, the listeners for this show, we talk a lot about the importance of family and motherhood and fatherhood. So most people listening are already on board that, yes, of course, it's important to have moms and dads, and marriage is great. But I want to start with the kind of high-level facts, as you have a ton of research in your book that breaks down the real world impact of not getting married, the impact of that on kids when there's a single parent raising a child versus two. Walk us through some of that research, high level, about what are the concrete outcomes and the differences in outcomes for children in the two-parent family unit versus single parents.
Okay, so there are dozens, if not hundreds, of studies from across social science. So economists, sociologists, psychologists, lots of folks have looked at the determinants of measurable kids' outcomes. So to be clear, this isn't about whether kids are good people or happy or well-adjusted adults, but the kinds of markers we have in our nationally representative data sets that we track as social scientists, performance in school, whether kids graduate high school, et cetera. And what study after study shows is that kids who have the benefit of growing up in a married parent home, as compared to, typically the research has focused on single mother homes because they've been the majority of one-parent households, all of these studies show over and over that kids from two-parent homes are less likely to grow up in poverty, and then consequently, they're less likely to get in trouble in school. They're more likely to have higher test scores, graduate from high school, be less likely to wind up engaged in crime, be less likely to become teen unmarried parents themselves. Studies that look at longer-term outcomes show that kids who grow up, again, in two-parent homes, largely because they're more likely to have experienced homes with higher levels of resources, more income, have other benefits that two-parent homes bring, they are ultimately more likely to obtain higher levels of education, college graduation, achieve higher levels of earnings, and more likely to be married themselves as adults. And this is really important because this starts pointing to what we're going to see, which is like the intergenerational persistence of advantage and disadvantage through kids based on whether they grew up in a single parent or a married parent home. So lots of studies show that. One of the key major facts that I'm trying to highlight in my book is just the sort of class disparities in which kids now have access to this beneficial two-parent home structure. And I think it's underappreciated just how much things have diverged in U.S. society in the past 40 years, such that now kids who are born to college-educated parents are substantially more likely to be raised in two-parent homes. And again, that's just perpetuating the advantage of that group and the disadvantage of the groups who don't have access to a two-parent home.
Now, you've mentioned at least two other factors in addition to them being two-parent households, and that is college education and then income, the level of income that the family has, and how those are additional benefits to or correlated to benefits for the child. So I'd love to kind of break this down, starting with the income issue, because you could have a very, low income two-parent household, and then, there are high income single parent households. How does that then impact the children in terms of, what's most important? Is it having two children or two parents, or is it having, a certain level of income according to your research?
Yeah. So this is important. So I'm going to give sort of a two-part answer to this. Mm-hmm. The first is, let me acknowledge the fact that parents who have college degrees are much more likely to be raising their kids in a married or two-parent home. So what sort of people who are skeptical that family structure matters will say is like, oh, well, they were already advantaged parents, right? But I actually think we can't just dismiss that. So if let me just put some numbers on this. A child whose mom has a 4-year college degree, 12% of those kids will grow up with just their mom. 30% of kids whose moms don't have a college degree will grow up with just their mom in the house, like an unpartnered mother, not a husband, but not an an unmarried partner either. So that's a really big disparity. So you take this group that's already more likely to be economically less secure because they don't have a college degree. And we know that a college degree means someone's more likely to have greater economic security, lower unemployment rates, higher income. You take an economically less secure group and amplify the economic insecurity by having this much higher rate of only having one parent in the house. So it's not that family structure doesn't matter. It's family structure matters on top of these other differences across adults with and without a college degree. Okay, second, in terms of income as a mechanism, so it's not just this selection that people with higher education, higher income are actually more likely to have two parents. Even when you look across across parents of similar education levels, so I look at the kids of, whose moms have less than a high school degree, or a high school degree or some college, or a college degree. Even within those education groups, you see that the kids whose moms are married, again, that's what we have in the data, right? We see the kids whose moms are married, those kids are more likely to graduate high school. The differences are actually largest in the middle of the education group, where the decline in marriage has been the greatest. Intuitively, that makes some sense. So if let me just be very precise about this. So if your mom has less than a high school degree, right, she probably will struggle to create a resource-rich home environment. But even moms with less than a high school degree who are married, given assortative mating, their partner, the dad, is probably also of limited education, maybe a lot of economic instability, right? There's not that much of a boost. There's not as large of a boost to, let's say, high school graduation rates or college attendance rates as in the middle when you take two parents who both have a high school degree. There's actually a much larger increase in the difference between how their kids do in terms of whether they graduate high school. And you could think of that as, if I take a mom with, a high school degree, some college who's maybe making like $45,000 versus a mom and a dad living together, both making about that much, that could make the difference in terms of what kind of neighborhood they're living in, what kind of schools their kids attend, etc. When it comes to does a child complete college, actually the gaps in outcomes between kids whose parents are married or not just continues up the education distribution, which is really interesting. It's basically within education group, whether the child graduates college by the age of 25, it's twice as high for kids who have married parents. And so even among moms,
even if the parents are college educated and
even
separated.
if they're college educated. So even if you take the kids whose moms are college educated, those whose moms are single, unmarried when the child is 14 versus married, so they're more likely to be living in a one-parent versus two-parent house, they are, the chance that they graduate college goes from like 25% to over 50%. So that advantage of having a second parent, we see that in the data, regardless of parents' education level or mother's education level. If I can, I said I was going to answer it in two ways. I'm going to answer it in a third way. So it turns out that income is a big part of what's driving these differences, but it's not all of it. So income's also a mechanism through which the married parent or two-parent household is delivering these benefits to kids. But there's also lots of evidence that parents are doing more than just providing additional income, and we can see that in the data.
Okay, so it sounds like if I'm understanding you correctly, there's a number of different, you call them privileges, that a child can have. Obviously, the level of education that their parents or parent has matters a lot. The income that they're able to bring in, how many resources are available in the household. But then in addition to those two is a significant one of family structure, married parents raising the child together. So even if the married parents are only high school educated and they're not particularly well off, maybe they have sort of a low income status, those kids are still going to be doing better than if they're raised in a single parent household that is wealthier? I mean, how does that compare?
So it turned, any of us who have kids know that parents do more than just provide income to the household and spend money on their kids. They, spend time with their kids. They try to be nurturing. We try and read to our kids. We try and patiently talk to our kids, all sorts of things. And in the book, I refer in particular to two types of resources beyond financial resources. One is parental time, and two is emotional bandwidth. Okay, so let me focus on time. Raising kids requires a lot of time. And it's not to denigrate or chastise all of the single parents who are doing everything they can to provide everything they can for their kids. But two parents in the household means there's just more combined time to invest in their kids. And actually what we see in time use data, which is collected by the federal government, we've got nationally representative survey of households on their time use. We see that married parents, both mothers and fathers, individually actually spend more time with their kids than unmarried parents. Why? How do we think about that? Well, if there's another parent in the house who can help, bring in money, so they're working outside the house, they can help drive the kids around, they can help with household chores. Individually, married parents have more time to give to their kids. But when you combine them, then the kids are, sort of doubly benefiting from extra parental time investment. And then there's suggestive evidence that time that parents spends with kids, helping them with their homework, reading to them, taking them to their enrichment activities, those all help the kids do better in life on these metrics that we can track, again, in data as social scientists, how they do in school, whether they get in trouble with the law, etc. The additional bucket of resource, let's call it emotional bandwidth. Different scholars in different fields refer to this differently. So some behavioral economists will refer to this as cognitive bandwidth. Can you make good decisions? And it turns out that if you're stressed and resources are tight, it's harder to make good decisions, right? This feels intuitive, but researchers have done a lot of work to document this. And development psychologists, among others, have documented that single mother households are more likely to have what they'll refer to as toxic stress. Again, none of this is to say anything negative about single parents. It's more of a reflection of the reality. If you're the only parent in the household who has to pay all the bills and take care of the house and take care of all the kids, you're more likely to be stressed. And when you're stressed, it's harder to be able to sit down and patiently talk to your child or help them with their homework, etc. And so again, we just see that in the data. And that's why I do talk about the two-parent household as being a privilege, frankly, to both the children and the parents, to have someone else who can give them a break or lend a helping hand.
Do you love coffee? I love coffee. Every morning I wake up and I drink my 7 Weeks coffee. I've talked about them on the show before, but 7weekscoffee.com is gourmet, low acid, small batch roasted, ethically sourced, delicious coffee, all different blends that you can find at 7weeks.com. And they're amazing. If you haven't tried them, check them out. You got to try them. What I love about 7 Weeks Coffee is they're not just the most delicious coffee, but this is a brand that supports your values. So 10% of all the revenue that 7 Weeks Coffee brings in goes directly to fund pro-life pregnancy centers to support moms and babies in need. And you can join the Heartbeat Club online at 7weekscoffee.com and use the code Lila to get up to 25% off your first order. So by joining the Heartbeat Club, you get coffee delivered to your door every single month, and you're also supporting the pro-life movement, and your first order is 25% off. So it's a great deal. Check it out. Go to 7weekscoffee.com today and use the code Lila at checkout to join the Heartbeat Club and get 25% off your order. How much does the actual, and I want to get to the single parent experience because so many people have that experience, people listening, I know there's single parents who are listening who's like, okay, shoot, what do I do? How do I, it's already hard enough. Yeah. So I want to, explore that deeply because I think it's so important. And I have so much respect for those that are pioneering the way and having to do it solo for whatever number of reasons, and are still so deeply committed to loving and raising their children. I think it requires a tremendous amount of sacrifice, and it's beautiful to see. But you mentioned several times these two-parent households and marriage. How important is the marriage part? Because there are a number of cohabitating households, and you mentioned single moms and single dads too, but certainly with single moms, often there is another partner present in the household. Sometimes that changes. There's not a marriage commitment to that partner. So there's, a live-in boyfriend. So what is the impact of a cohabitating a subsequent parent who's acting not as a biological parent, but in the role of a parent? And then in addition, the biological parent, they're both the biological parents, and they are cohabitating but not married.
Yeah. So as a practical matter, what we know from U.S. Census data is that now only 63% of kids in the U.S. live with married parents. That's pretty low, 63%. That's down from 77% just 40 years ago. So really big drop, 77% to 63% in 40 years. Most of that decline occurred in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. It sort of stabilized in the low 60%. Only 8% of kids in the U.S. Census are living with what I categorize as cohabiting parents, and that means one parent and the parent's unmarried partner. And in about a quarter to 40% of those cases, that unmarried partner is not the child's second biological parent. So even that 8% sort of overstates the share of kids living with their cohabiting parents. Okay. The more likely scenario after married parents is an unpartnered mother. So 21% of kids are growing up with a mother who has neither, or are living at a point in time, I should say, who's living with a mother who has, neither a spouse or an unmarried partner in the household. But 67% of those households don't have another adult, right? So it's a minority of the cases where, let's say, there's an aunt or a grandma living there who might be helping out, playing the role a second parent might play to some extent. About 4.5% of kids are living with an unpartnered father. So I think it's really important to be clear on those numbers, because I often get the sense that people are too sanguine about the idea, now parents are just being more progressive and living together in a stable cohabiting arrangement, but they're not married. It's actually just not true in the data. The other thing I will say is, as compared to Europe, we have far fewer parents living together in an unmarried cohabiting situation. But also as compared to cohabitation in Europe, cohabitation in the U.S., for a variety of reasons we could speculate about, winds up being a pretty unstable institution. So a lot of those cohabiting couples with children will not stay together during the course of their child's childhood. Now, of course, some married parents break up too, but the rate of dissolution among cohabiting couples is much larger than the rate of dissolution among married parents. And one of the things that researchers have documented is that children whose parents are unmarried, they just experience a lot more family transitions over their childhood, which is not great for kids. So Andrew Cherlin, a sociologist from Johns Hopkins, has documented that kids in the U.S. are far more likely than kids in other countries to have multiple father figures, or really maternal boyfriends, in their house before the age of 15 than anywhere else. And those situations are often pretty, damaging for kids. So I don't think we should be too sanguine about it. Having said all that, what the data descriptively shows is that kids clearly perform best, or are most likely to hit these sort of success metrics, again, that we can see in the data, if they're growing up with their two biological parents through their childhood. The kids whose outcomes are worse in terms of having the highest likelihood of dropping out of high school or becoming teen parents or not going to college, they tend to be the children whose parents were never married, right? Now, some of that, of course, is just selection, representing who's never married versus married. Kids who's live with their mom who's remarried, they fall somewhere in the middle, because a lot of what remarriage does is replace a lot of the income loss, which is very beneficial, because then people can stay in their homes or live in better neighborhoods with better schools and lower crime rates. But I don't study step parents, but my read of that literature is step parents can be a bit complicated, right? I mean, like anything else, there's a lot of variety there.
Sure. So it sounds like the bottom line, though, is there's sort of a path of success that is very highly documented, and that it's real, which is complete your high school education, and before you have a baby, get married, and have that basic level of stability locked in, and then children. So basically, education, marriage, children, and the education, obviously, college education it sounds like is the best according to the research in terms of the long-term stability. But high school education is pretty good too, to at least complete that. And so, when you look at that trajectory, what's your opinion on how we have changed as a society? You mentioned that marriage rates have declined. You talked about how now used to be 77% of children growing up in a two-parent household, married parents, and now that has dropped to the low 60s. How long has this trend been taking place, and what are your theories for why these negative trends are taking place?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in the book trying to explain my read of all of the data and evidence, but I will give you the sort of broad strokes of the sort of underlying narrative that I take away from the data and mounds of evidence. So let's start with the 60s and 70s. There was the social revolution, cultural changes, the introduction of the pill, legalization of abortion, all sorts of things that changed the institution around getting married and having kids. And we saw a reduction in shotgun marriage. But basically what we saw over the 60s and 70s was a decline in marriage across the education distribution. Like college-educated adults, high school-educated adults, adults with less than a high school degree, all moved away from marriage in roughly equal proportion. And then going into the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the trends diverged. And this is really where the interesting story, from my perspective, is, and the story I tell. In the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, marriage stopped falling among college-educated adults. It stabilized. So even if you look at from 1980 to now, the share of kids growing up in a married parent home among those with college-educated moms, that only fell from 90% to 84%, only a 6 percentage point drop. That's not that large, especially considering how much larger the group of college-educated moms are. That's 30% of moms now as compared to 11%. But outside the college-educated class, marriage continued falling for all adults. And so high school-educated adults, it's a straight line down.
Just a quick interruption here, because it's such a fascinating point that you're making, and I want to make sure I'm tracking here, and it's so important for the audience too, for folks listening, is that it's they talk about the sort of privilege of elites, or elitist morality, where it says for the lower income classes, sex outside of marriage and the sexual revolution, all of these things are fine and it should be fine for everyone. But then the upper classes, so to speak, are practicing these traditional ethics. And it sounds like what you're saying is, despite the sexual libertinism and the social revolutions of the 60s and 70s and all these changes with abortion and birth control and sexual ethics, today's average college graduated kind of well-off person still understands that getting married is important, having children within marriage is important, and their abortion rates are actually lower than lower income and lower, you could say, class groups. But they're still professing, there's still this kind of tendency, I would say, to profess that these things don't matter for anyone, while the kind of upper class, if we can call it that, is actually practicing the traditional morality. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, this is why, from an equity perspective, I think it's really counterproductive and remarkably unhelpful for college-educated chattering class, as it's sometimes called, to pretend this isn't an issue. And, I'm also feeling a bit defensive because I've had all these feminist writers, say that I'm anti-feminist. And my response to that is, no. Those of us who have really benefited from feminism, who have all these career opportunities open to us, who are now bringing in good, financial income on our own, we are all much more likely to be doing the hard job of raising our kids with the benefit of the spouse in the house. And so it's not helpful from an equity perspective to not acknowledge that the women who have not benefited as much as us, who are finding themselves financially less secure, are also much more likely to find themselves in the very hard position of having to do this by themselves. And so as feminists who would like to see more women thriving, we should be deeply concerned with this class disparity in how many moms are finding themselves doing this by themselves, in particular, outside the very economically privileged class. So the way I read sort of the situation is that in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you had this looser social norm around childbearing and the two-parent necessity and the, combining marriage with the practice of having and raising kids. You combine that with a whole bunch of economic shocks that really disadvantaged non-college educated workers, in particular men. And I talk about very sophisticated studies in the book that work to tease out causal channels here between things like, exogenous systematic shocks that led to a loss of well-paying manufacturing jobs or industrial jobs, or these jobs that a lot of men without a college degree used to hold and be able to bring in family-sustaining wages in the communities that were hit by those economic shocks. We see a reduction in male employment and a corresponding rise in the share of kids born outside marriage and growing up in single mother homes. And so the story here is one where economic vulnerability is both a cause and effect of the trends I'm highlighting. And that's why, again, from a compassionate perspective or an equity perspective, we should really care about what's happened to families outside the college-educated class and how the economic changes that have led to inequality in the U.S., that have hurt the economic security of non-college educated workers, they've led to worse family outcomes, an increase in one-parent homes, and that consequently reinforces the inequality, making things much worse.
A big thank you to our sponsor, NimiSkincare.com. That's Nimi Skincare.com. I use Nimi Skincare products. I love them. I've shopped for over a decade for products, tried all these different companies. Many of them are anti-life, anti-family, very woke companies. And I found Nimi Skincare, which supports our values, but also has amazing products that are very clean. They have simple different skincare lines that you can choose from, and their products are amazing. I love their deep moisturizing clean. I love their peptide cream, which I use in the evening, as well as their brightening sunscreen, which I put on every morning. Again, great products. I think you're going to love it. Go to NimiSkincare.com. You can use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. If you want to try a new skincare brand, you're not happy with what you're using, you've got to try Nimi. That's NimiSkincare.com, Nimi, and use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. So yeah, there's a lot of talk about the collapsing of the middle class, and there's no longer being a blue collar worker and being able to support your family certainly on one income. It's nearly impossible across the country. And so speaking from sort of the motivational perspective, or the perspective of sort of motivations and the instinct of, let's say, a young man who, maybe he finds out he's the father of his girlfriend's baby, or forget that, he's just contemplating his future, and marriage is not even something he's contemplating actively because he can't even provide for himself. And so this idea that he's going to go get married and have a family in the current economic climate just perhaps seems out of reach for him.
And I like the way you put that, because often people put this from the perspective of women. And so it could be either the woman's decision or the man's decision. As we say in economics, it's like an equilibrium outcome. We see them both, and it's probably driven by both. The way you tell the story is the man thinks like, I can't even afford my own place. I'm living in my parents' basement. I can't take responsibility for my girlfriend and the child we've created. And by the way, we have social norms now that makes that much more acceptable to do, right? And I should say, you have the woman saying, look, it's hard, but I have my job, and I don't really need to have another mouth to feed or have a man in my house who's in and out of work and maybe brings some other struggles. So for both of them, the economic value proposition of marriage has been somewhat eroded. And so the problem here is that the child is left without the benefit of two parents in the household. And so it's really what I can't quantify is I can't look at the distribution of one parent households and say this many of them would clearly benefit if they combined forces and did this together, right? And maybe they just don't understand that their economic security and their childhood will be better for all of them if they make this work. I can't tell you what share that is, but it's presumably greater than zero. I can't tell you what share is, look, they want to make it work. We see that in a lot of smaller survey and ethnographic work, that a lot of these low-income unmarried parents say they want to make it work. A majority of them in the Fragile Family Survey at the time of their child's birth say they want to stay together. But then sadly, a majority of those dads are not with the child by the time the child turns 5, right? So there it's like, okay, they want to be together. what can communities or government programs do to help them overcome the barriers? Mm-hmm. Is it a matter of job training? Is it a matter of parenting classes? Is it a matter of some income support? Probably all of the above, right? So what are those barriers we can help them address? And then let's be clear, there's some set of situations where the parents shouldn't be together, where there's violence or abuse, and it wouldn't be to anyone's benefit to have them be together. I can't quantify, but it's a really large share, right? More than 30% of kids living outside a two-parent household, 40% of births now being unmarried, being to non-married parents. It's a big group. And so my best guess is there's some of all of this. And then trying to help people where they are is really what's important.
I mean, it sounds like there's 3 factors that need to be addressed in order to solve this problem. And one of them you mentioned just a moment ago is, the social norm of saying that, no, marriage is good. Keeping sex within marriage and having children within marriage is a good thing, as opposed to just anything goes. As long as you use birth control, you'll be fine. We know that that doesn't work. In reality, birth control doesn't solve the problem of unplanned pregnancy. It hasn't. So there's that piece of it, the social norm and adjusting the way we think about sexual ethics and marriage. And then there's the economic piece, because even if you have the social norms, it can still be really hard for couples. I think about the economic piece in terms of public policy and obviously, not-for-profit work and, churches and communities. But in public policy, I think there should be cash benefits for parents, especially intact parents that are married, who have children, so that can actually help them support their family and be able to have a roof over their head and steady, housing and, food on the table and have their needs met. And we should be prioritizing that for families. So instead of just tax benefits, it's actually a cash credit where you actually get money for kids. This is being tried in some other countries like Hungary. And then I think the final piece there too is that these families, the families that are struggling, that are broken, there's abuse, there's addiction, there's reasons that they're separated, right? Right. Just having better support systems for those that are struggling, that can be public policy, but also just in our communities, focusing on really helping single families because we know they struggle more. So I think 100%. Those 3 pieces, if we can focus on them, I think there will be a lot more improvements for outcomes for kids and happier adults too. I'm curious your take on that. I'm especially curious your take on the idea of, cash benefits for families, especially if they're married, for children. I know Hungary, I don't know if you've looked at some of their family policy programs, but they say no income tax if you have 4 kids and you're married. I mean, they really have a stack of benefits to encourage people to not just have kids, but be able to support their kids financially.
Yeah, so I am 100% with you that we need a more family-friendly policy agenda, and we need much more help to families. The first thing we have to do before we can even get there is be willing to acknowledge that families matter, that what's happened to families in the U.S. has not been good for kids. There's a lot of resistance to just acknowledging that. So, there's
Why
some
is that,
people
by the
who
way?
see, what's that?
Yeah. What do you chalk that up to? Why there's so much resistance to that obvious reality?
I like to think that it's mostly from a well-intentioned instinct, however misguided, but to not stigmatize certain groups of families. I mean, you see certain groups putting out we have to. When I looked up two-parent privilege, has anyone used that term before? When I was looking for a title for my book, I found groups arguing that we needed to remove the idea that certain families were privileged over others, and I was like, but that's just not true. We see very, very clearly in the data that certain families are privileged and advantaged over others. So we have to be willing to acknowledge that, to then say, let's make strengthening families a policy priority. And my experience with the policy conversation over the past 20 years focused on closing class or racial gaps in kids' outcomes wants to talk about everything other than strengthening families. And so it's, how much more can we ask schools to do? How much more can we ask teachers and school counselors to do before we realize what we actually have to do is address the deficits and class and racial gaps in home environment? So I'm 100% with you. That needs to be a policy priority. When it comes to a stronger safety net, yes, yes, yes. So a lot of, let's say, more politically conservative policymakers will not want to expand the safety net because of the worry that if we make it easier for single parent families, we will undermine marriage. So I think it's really important to address that point. What we do know is that in the past, a lot of our cash welfare programs, even Medicaid, was explicitly conditioned on being a single mom, right? So we can't have benefits conditioned on being a single parent, because then we are explicitly saying you have to make this choice. You can have access to these benefits or you can be married. So a lot of that's been removed very helpfully, but we should go further. I am not in favor of just giving benefits to married parent families, because there are so many lower resource single parent families and kids. And I will take the trade actually of even sort of a few people on the margin saying, okay, I realize this is going to make them less likely to be married, but ultimately we just can't let kids languish in under-resourced homes. But what we should do quite explicitly is work to remove the disincentives inherent in our tax code, in our safety net programs, in Medicaid. Like, that's a very salient one. If you get married and your household income goes above a threshold, these moms and kids lose Medicaid. That's a big loss. And so we need to sort of approach our design of safety net programs with an eye towards family impacts to remove those disincentives.
What if at minimum, there should be no disincentive for marriage, and they should have the same benefits as a single parent household. And then in addition, there are additional benefits. So you're not saying there's no safety net for a single parent, because it is hard. And we want to encourage single parents to do the very best they can. And, when it comes to abortion, I think that's a huge reason many people think about abortion, is that they think, I can't do this, I don't have the support I need. And so I think we need to double down on supporting people regardless of their marriage status, right?
I'm all for supporting people regardless, and getting many more benefits to kids and families regardless of parents' marital status. But the other thing you raised, which I think again is, everybody should be in favor of this across the political spectrum, is much more programmatic support for families and parents in particular who are struggling with intimate partner violence, with alcohol and drug abuse, with untreated mental health conditions. Who wouldn't want to support that, right? But
meaning, and when you say support them, do you mean, now we're talking, because I think we need to have more advantages for married couples, so that people want to be married and there's economic incentives to get married and stay married. Now you're talking about obviously these very challenging cases, drug addiction, abuse, domestic violence, et cetera. In those situations, are you speaking about folks that are married and navigating, that, or just in general, people struggling with that and the negative incomes on children?
Yeah, I mean in general. So for example, if you think about, our foster care system or child protective services, a lot of the emphasis there is removing children from, negligent or potentially dangerous situations, which is super important. But then we need to be doing so much more to invest in families and parents, whether they're married or not, so they can parent the way, they want to parent, right? Let's take it as a given that most parents want to be good parents for their kids. And I think, if you just look at the federal budget, if you just look at the budget of our Department of Health and Human Services, there is pitifully little dedicated to programs that are aimed at strengthening and supporting stable and healthy families. Again, why is that? I think because we haven't made strengthening families a policy priority. And so we just can't keep expanding the safety net or hiring school counselors, both things I think we need to do, without realizing that fundamentally how kids do in this world is going to come down a lot to parents. And so we need to be investing in parents as kids' greatest asset. I will say that might feel like it's not a very big statement for me to make, but in the policy world, there are some pretty strong negative reactions to that.
On both sides, right?
From both sides. Let's say I'll point fingers, even though I really don't like doing that. But let's say, social conservatives who want people to make different choices, but then don't want to spend tax dollars investing in families. And then from progressives who basically want the state to do more to raise kids and sort of separate out kids' outcomes from their family of origin. And that's just I think that's practically never going to happen, but also that fundamentally gets to how we view society and the role of family.
Yeah.
And from a normative perspective, I'm willing to say the family is the most important unit in our society.
Your little one deserves the best products, the best diapers and wipes products, and that's why I love everylife.com. As you know, a lot of diaper companies today support abortion. It's absolutely tragic and unfortunate that they are supporting actually the destruction of their littlest patients. What I love about everylife.com is this is America's fastest growing and pro-life company, separate things, fastest growing, and they're also pro-life company. They donate part of their revenue back to the pro-life movement to support moms and babies in need, and they've got awesome products. So go to everylife.com today, check out their diapers and their wipes. These are very deeply absorbent, great quality materials for your little one. Diapers and wipes, you can order a subscription bundle, have it come right to your door, and you can use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order. So check them out today. That's everylife.com. Use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order. Yeah, I've seen, for example, this push, and there's some of it on some parts of the right and certainly heavily on the left, government-funded daycare as an example. Make
Right.
sure that there's always childcare available that's government-funded, basically institutionalize early childhood development and have the government run it, and so that mothers can be out working and they have that freedom, quote-unquote, to work. And I just think, why don't you just direct that money directly to the mother instead of, off to some government worker to raise the child? And
Right.
instead of forcing her to go off and work, give her the benefit directly so she can be with her child. I mean, obviously there'll be, all kinds of nuances there, but at the end of the day, she's going to be the best person to raise that child.
I would say give families more resources and in the words of the way economists say this, is let families optimize. So there are some families for whom both parents would want to work or feel like they need to work and they need more help paying for child care. There are some families for whom one parent's going to want to stay home or they're both going to want to work part-time and stay home. Give them more support so they can make that choice. Families just need much more support in this country. And again, in a forward, what people really have to realize, what policymakers have to realize is that's not just a giveaway. That's not just consumption. That's how we invest in our nation's future, is making sure more kids are growing up in resource-rich environments so they have the best chance of meeting their, potential and being positive contributors to society going forward. And so it's, to the detriment of our entire society that we basically just don't do nearly enough to help kids. And I think, again, we're not going to be able to really help kids if we don't focus on the family.
Absolutely. But, to what you're saying, not all choices are equal, including choices that even families may make independently with sort of many options presented them in potential public support. And so, that's kind of what I'm getting at here is, what is the ideal we should strive towards culturally and in our public policy as it's appropriate. And, you've identified obviously marriage and a two-parent family as part of that end game that we should be striving for and upholding. So, back to the question of raising very young children, especially, and, the whole issue, the whole experience of pregnancy and birth and that whole process, it's very formative for children the first 3 years of their life. Should the government just be completely, apathetic about how and what the family unit is doing in those early years, meaning give the mother a chunk of money to go off and have the corporate job so she can stick the child in daycare versus should the government more prioritize or encourage that bond between the mother and the child? I certainly think maternity leave policies are fantastic. Let the child not just bond with the mother, but have that crucial time. But usually, we're talking 6 weeks to maybe, max 6 months in this country. The first 3 years, scientifically speaking, are key for any child's development. So do you think that we should prioritize that in both public policy and kind of cultural trends, that we want mothers to be able to mother their children, not just as their choice because it's their freedom to do what they want to do, but for the sake of the child?
Yeah, you're not going to get me to say that, I lament women or mothers working outside the home. And I think that would be a tough evidence-based case to make.
Well, it's not to be that drastic, because I think there's a lot of different versions of working outside the home. I work, right? And I have very young children, but I am able to work in a way that is highly flexible so that I am the primary caretaker still for my kids. I know that's a privilege right there. I have that privilege.
Right.
But should we be seeing that as an ideal that the mother can be there again, a significant amount of the time for young children. Do you think that's something that's worth upholding as a society and then shaping public policy to support?
Look, what we know is that kids benefit when they have resource-rich environments and when they have time invested in them and emotional bandwidth invested in them from either parent, from both parents. And we also know that a lot of families feel like they can't afford to have parents working part-time or one parent staying home. And so what I think needs to happen from a policy matter is for more people to be given resources so they can make those choices. It's actually, if you look at sort of experiments that have gotten more women to go to work, it's really hard to see that, it's necessarily bad for kids, but part of it is because the additional income they bring in is often very helpful. And so there's not a clear-cut case in saying this is the way parents should make their work schedules work that would be best. And it also depends crucially on, I'm trying to think of how to say it without jargon, but what we say is the counterfactual. So for example, when there are early childhood education programs and 3 and 4-year-olds go to school, right? We actually see that if they're coming from a home that's more disadvantaged, that seems to be beneficial for them. If they're coming from a higher resourced home where the mom has a higher level of education, that actually doesn't seem to be so beneficial. And so what they're getting at home and what kind of engagement they're getting from their parents sort of shapes what happens to them if they go to a daycare or an early childhood education. And then, of course, it's about the quality of that place. And so it's really hard to make these generalizations about what type of parent work / stay home with the kid / early childhood program is best on average. That one's a lot harder for me to make, whereas I am very, very confident saying that the data and evidence make it very clear that kids who grow up with 2 parents in their home are in a better position to succeed than whether they have one.
Well, I think the reason you have that confidence, and you kind of indicated this earlier, is because, like you said, most people want the best outcomes for their kids. Most people are striving towards the healthiest situation for their family, and so their choices will often align with what is best. You mentioned abuse and drug addiction and things like that earlier, and clearly, if there's a severely unbalanced home life, there's abuse in the home, there's neglect in the home, then yes, you can understand why a child being sent to some sort of a daycare environment for the majority of their day will be healthier for them, functional daycare, than being in a home with drug addicted or abusive parents or neglectful parents. So that, I think, is a no-brainer. I think what I'm getting at here is not so much a generalization as, again, what is the ideal that we should be aiming at, and not being afraid to state the ideal as a society, because I think that's kind of your criticism earlier about the way that we see family structures, is that people are just afraid to say, yes, 2 parents is better than not, and married parents is best. And so similarly, talking about, I care a lot about young child development. We talk about it on the podcast a lot. I have young kids. We have a lot of young moms and young families and men who listen, fathers who listen. And I think having sort of bright lines about, yes, it is best, if it is economically possible, which I think if with enough sort of ingenuity, it often can be. Some people, I think, especially interestingly, the college educated class, I think sometimes we think we need to have a certain standard of life in order to be okay. And so both parents feel like they have to bring in a certain amount of income, and we forget the economic value, quite frankly, of a woman who is working not full-time, but maybe part-time and able to manage the household more, able to be a primary caretaker for the children more. I just think we need to normalize and encourage that more as a society, because it's become so discouraged. The stay-at-home mom almost is looked down upon as a class in this country. The educated and sort of professional career woman who's working 40 plus hours a week is more upheld as sort of this ideal of being empowered as a woman. And my concern is that we're not properly elevating the status of being a mother of very young children and being available and engaged in the home more than you might be able to if you're working the 40+ hour corporate job. What are your thoughts?
That's, I mean, I hear you saying that, that's an ideal you want to normalize. I based on data and evidence, I'm not prepared to make that case. And actually, sometimes I think conflating the conversation about the reduction in two-parent homes with a lament that more moms are working outside the home is precisely why more people aren't getting on the bandwagon or willing to acknowledge that the decline in parental marriage has been tough on kids.
How do you mean? Make sure I'm
How do I
understanding.
mean? I'm very, very clear that I am not looking with nostalgia for a return to the male breadwinner, the mom's day.
Oh, I see. Meaning it's just that your concern is that there's a disincentive for women to want to get married if it means to them this sort of like 1940s housewife trope that they're going to be stuck in now.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that I think is an intriguing idea, which I don't have the answer to, is why is it that college educated parents, where the moms are more likely to be working outside the home, working longer hours, why is that where marriage is holding strong? And are men in the college educated class more egalitarian in their views of marriage? So in my mind, I think there's a question is, to what extent is part of the divergence because men outside the college educated class are less willing to support professionally successful women? And so, that could be, like, I get a lot of reactions from people to my book, hey, until you break the patriarchy, you're not going to get a return to marriage. And so if we say that the ideal is it's not just married parents, it's married parents and the mom being the primary homemaker and childcare provider, we might not make progress on this. Because what we see across countries, not just the U.S., is women are working essentially across all countries, and about 85% of women now work, moms now work. And what's also true across high-income countries is that the total fertility rate is way down. And so my view on that is, you might not like it or you might disagree with it, but a lot of women are prioritizing having their independent career over having kids. And the more we underscore attention there, then the more we're going to see people, I think, choosing to either not be married or not have kids, or having kids but not be married. And so, again, for me, the first order thing here is kids do better when there's two parents in the household, and everything else is a little bit nuanced on that arrangement.
Do you think that maternity leaves should be longer than paternity leaves, provided both are long enough?
No, I wouldn't be in favor of that.
Okay. So it's kind of in your view in your economic work has been that there is no difference meaningfully between a mother versus a father when it comes to childbearing and child raising, especially I'm focusing on those first few years of life of a child.
This is not my area of expertise.
Okay. It is something I'm very interested in exploring because, the two-parent household, I think you do talk a little bit about mothers versus fathers in your book, but it's not, like you're saying, as explored. And I do think that also does matter because, the experience of bringing a child into the world is unique to women, obviously, and not to say fathers don't have a crucial role that they do. But I do think that having a gender-blind approach as a culture, saying mothers and fathers are interchangeable, they're just two human beings and they don't really do anything uniquely different for child raising is biologically untrue, because only women carry children, we nurse, we have this unique way that we interact with a child, especially when they're very young. And I think there's an important thing to explore there, both economically with our public policy recommendations, and then, of course, culturally in encouraging that for women, because otherwise we're saying, women, you're interchangeable with a man. They can do whatever you can do whatever they can do. And I do think that might send the wrong message to women when we're making all these important choices about our careers and children and families and everything else.
Yeah, I don't think I'm saying any of that. But I am noticing we're at 1, so I actually do have to drive to campus and teach my class now.
Okay. Oh, no worries. Well, thank you so much. Melissa, where can people find your work?
They can find my work on my website, which is, it's easy to Google me, Melissa Kearney, University of Maryland Economics, and my website will come up, and you'll get links to the book that we've been talking about, The Two-Parent Privilege, and I have a lot of the work, the figures and the tables that are in the book are on my website, and also the underlying academic research that I draw on.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much, Melissa.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Okay, take care. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Lila Rose podcast. I know we kind of ended a little bit abruptly there. I think Melissa has such important research to share, and her book is very important and a great contribution to the conversation happening about parent structure. I do think it's fair to note, though, that there seems to be this taboo among those in academia today, certainly in politics to some degree, and just sort of the professional class, to say that there's a difference between mothering, especially the mothering of very young children, and fathering. This is not to say that fathers can't do a lot of nurture for very young children and mothers can't bring in significant resources to the family outside the home when there are young children. It's not to say mothers should never work, none of that, but it is to say that I think it is important, both for public policy and for culture, to acknowledge that men and women are different when it comes to child rearing, and that women of very young children need and deserve special support. And we should encourage, quite frankly, mothers being there for their very young children. And I don't think we should back away from that reality. Now, the implications of that reality are another story, and we can wade through them. We often go through them on this podcast. But I think it is important to reassert that, no, this is not the 1940s housewife trope, but that this is a reality about, and a beautiful reality about motherhood and fatherhood, that mothers being there for their very young children is something we should prize as a society and arrange, whether it's public policy, as well as encourage it culturally. And I don't think that's a truth that we should shy away from. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Check us out on Locals and Patreon so you can help us continue to make more content like this. And we will see you next time.